Ikoria Lair of Behemoths, Sundered Bond. Chapter 1. Lukka found what he was looking for by following the buzz of carrion flies. The sheep lay where it had fallen, hidden in a fold of the gently rolling pasture. Its woolly white coat was splotchy with brown blood, but the only wounds were on its head. The top of its skull had been removed, as neat a job as any Drannith surgeon might have managed, and the brain had been removed. The flies that had led Lukka to the corpse clustered thick around the poor creature's glassy eyes and lolling tongue. A nightmare for certain, Lukka thought, prodding the body with his boot. Flies rose, and as if offended, he waved them away. Anything else would have eaten more of the kill. We've got tracks, Captain. Aoife sauntered over, giving the dead sheep only a passing glance. She was tiny, head coming only to Lukka's shoulder, and her cherubic face with its blonde curls led many people to assume she was soft. Lukka, who'd seen her butcher a three-horned charger with a skinning knife, no longer made that mistake. Heading south, Lukka said, meaning toward Drannith, the great city they called home, meaning they had a problem. Heading south, Aoife confirmed. Lukka grunted, but he wasn't surprised. Anything that feeds on brains isn't going to be satisfied with sheep for long. They were in the fourth ring, the outermost of Drannith's concentric defensive zones, dedicated to pasturage and timber forests. Squads of soldiers, known to one and all as Coppercoats, for the copper bands and buttons on their uniforms, patrolled the city by day, and sometimes by night. But the fourth ring was too large to sweep entirely, and so it had no permanent human inhabitants. The shepherds and loggers retreated to well-guarded hamlets in the third ring at night. Lukka had no doubt the monster was heading in that direction as well. When it arrived, there would be carnage. Though any Coppercoat would give their life to defend Drannith from monsters, the local defense forces weren't equipped to take on something this deadly. Fortunately, that's where we come in. It'll have gone to ground for the day, Lukka said, glancing at the sun. Small chance of finding it in time. We'll push ahead and let it come to us. Aoife would have been within her rights to groan. They'd pushed hard getting out here, and Lukka's orders meant another long march, followed by a sleepless night. But Lukka hadn't made her his sergeant for nothing. She saluted, fist over heart, and turned away. A moment later, fingers in mouth, she gave a shrill, piercing whistle, a sound that always seemed far too loud to have come from the tiny woman. Lukka met up with the rest of his team, formerly the 1st Special Intercept Squad, though their branch was usually just called the Specials, back at the road. It was broad and well paved, arrow straight like all the highways that connected Drannith to its hinterlands, allowing for the rapid movement of troops in an emergency. To either side, the gently rolling fields dotted with clusters of fluffy white sheep gave way to a belt of forests a little farther south. In the other direction, the grassland stretched on forever, broken only by clumps of red-brown hills. That was wild country, the vast wastes of Savai, nothing but dry grass and monsters for hundreds of miles. Here and there, crystal formations rose into sky, facets gleaming white with the light of the afternoon sun. The other 3 members of his team had gathered in response to Aoife's whistle. Gox and Ghidra were twins, brother and sister, both over 6 feet tall and broad to match. Each had the long hilt of a hooked monster-killing greatsword over one shoulder. Beside them, Nick was a slimmer figure, though still a head taller than Aoife. Her brilliant crimson hair hung in a businesslike queue, tucked under the wide frame of her oversized crossbow. A quiver of bolts like miniature spears hung from her hip. All 5 of them wore heavy coats, symbols of the Drannith military, long leather dusters, with a faceted green crystal on the right shoulder. More crystals secured Lukka's collar, marking his rank, and all of them were functional as well as decorative. They would glow at the approach of most monsters. It was never a completely reliable warning, but Coppercoats learned to take any advantage they could. Aoife repeated Lukka's orders to the others, and Nick made up for the sergeant's stoicism with the volume and variety of her curses. Ghidra and Gox took the news with a shrug, adjusting their packs and the straps that held their massive weapons in place. After a short rest to wolf down field rations, the squad headed south at a steady pace. By the time the setting sun turned the western sky to blood, they were on the outskirts of the forest. Lukka lit a lantern and kept them moving a while longer, as the clouds went from red to purple and finally faded to black. The first stars were twinkling through the branches of the trees when he called a halt, raising the lantern over his head. "This should be far enough," he said. Somewhere to the north, the nightmare would be crawling out of whatever burrow it had found, hungry again and smelling the humans and animals of the villages inside the third ring. "Sergeant, find us a good spot." "You got it, Captain." Aoife took the lantern and led the way off the road into the woods. "What are you thinking?" Nick said. "Mid-range pattern?" "Close up," Lukka said. "Has to be." Nick made a face. "That's dangerous." "No way around it. Judging by how much ground it covered yesterday, this thing doesn't move until full dark. If we keep our distance, it might get past us." "And if we get too close, someone's likely to get their face torn off," Nick said. "Cheerful as always," Lukka said. "I'm the one who's going to be playing bait, so what do you have to worry about?" "He's just worried about your pretty face," Gox put in. "Don't worry, Captain," Ghidra said. "I'll still take you even if you'll get mangled." "Very generous," Lukka said dryly. Ever since he'd announced his engagement, Ghidra's teasing had been relentless. "But let's try to get this done with a minimum of me getting maimed, shall we?" "Here," Aoife said, stopping in a small clearing ringed with trees. "This'll do." Lukka looked the ground over with a practiced eye and nodded. "It will at that. Gox, Ghidra, on the flanks, Nick's to the rear. Sergeant, get set up, then join her." "On it," Aoife said, dropping to one knee and shrugging off her heavy pack. She began extracting the tools of the trapper's trade, spring-loaded trigger, coils of thin metal wire, barbed hooks attached to spun steel nets. Lukka judged where she was placing the snares, then settled himself against a tree a few yards off. Ghidra, abruptly all business, exchanged a few quiet words with her brother and vanished into the trees on one side, Gox taking the other. They moved surprisingly quickly for their size, and were soon lost to sight. Nick unshouldered her crossbow and started working the foot crank to cock it, the mechanism ratcheting back to the bowstring inch by inch until it was stiff with barely contained tension. She gave Lukka a nod and vanished into the trees as well. "All set, Captain," Aoife said, closing her pack again. To the casual eye, the grass of the clearing was unchanged, but Lukka wouldn't have wanted to set foot anywhere in it. The sergeant shouldered her pack and came over to him, avoiding her own tripwires. "Ready for the lure." "Open it up, Sergeant. Then get yourself hidden. I want this thing to be nice and focused when it comes in." The order was unnecessary, of course. This wasn't the first time they'd done this, or even the 50th, but it made Lukka feel better to say it out loud, even after spending half his life in the Coppercoats and the last 2 years as a captain in the specials. Moments like this made his pulse race and his palms itch. "It's perfectly rational," he told himself, as Aoife selected a small jar from among many in her pack. "Every monster is different. You never know if this is going to be the one that does something unexpected." The jar. When Aoife opened it, wafted an incredibly pungent smell into the air, something like a cross between raw onion and rotting meat. Aoife took a sniff, found it satisfactory, and set it down in front of Lukka. She offered him a salute, then followed Nick into the trees. Lukka was left alone in the clearing, the lantern sitting at his feet beside the jar of rank stuff. Now, we just hope this thing likes what it smells. A quarter of an hour passed, then another. Lukka's hands clenched, and he rubbed his knuckles against the hilt of the sword at his belt, an old, nervous habit. If it's gotten past us, if it doesn't take the bait. A spark gleamed in the depths of the crystal on his shoulder. The faintest light imaginable at first, but it grew steadily to a wan green glow. Here we go. The nightmare slid into the clearing like an inky shadow, insinuating itself out of the darkness. It was big, taller than a horse, and much longer, with 8 long legs ending in splayed talons. A snaky whipped tail curved behind it, and its diamond-shaped head rose on a long, sinuous neck studded with bony spikes. 3 pairs of red eyes, all glowing like banked embers, topped a long jaw full of corkscrew fangs, with a pair of worm-like tongues threaded between them. Lukka hated nightmares. They were less common than cats here in Savai, but often more dangerous, and so the specials were often called in to deal with them. Give me a nice, honest cat any day over that. The thing had sighted him, turning its head to give all 6 eyes a look. Its tongues flicked out, tasting the air. Lukka put a hand on his sword as it came forward, moving in gentle curves like an eel rippling through water, body boneless and flexible. Its feet made barely any sound. That's right, Lukka muttered. He put his hand on his sword. Here I am. He tried not to imagine his own head surgically opened, brain devoured. Dinner's on. Come and get it. The nightmare took a step forward, only yards away now, then another, gathering itself on its haunches, preparing to pounce on this strange human who inexplicably did not flee. It shifted, ready to leap. Aoife's trap went off with a metallic snap. Broad bands of metal netting whipped up from the floor of the clearing, drawn over and around the creature until they pulled tight. Inward-facing barbs dug into its scaly skin, hooks biting deep. The nightmare screeched, a warbling 2-tone sound like a badly tuned trumpet. It threw itself forward, straining at the net, but the metal wires that connected it to the trees held. Branches shuddered with the strength of the creature. Lukka grinned as its 4 claws waved helplessly in the air, a yard in front of him. His grin faded rapidly as it managed to work one limb free, dislocating whatever passed for its shoulder. Barbed hooks tore free, trailing black blood, and it lunged for him, claws spread. Lukka barely got his sword out in time, parrying the descending claw, and the strength of the nightmare nearly tore the weapon from his hands. He dropped to one knee, bracing the blade with his offhand, twitching talons only inches from his face. Take it! Aoife yelled. Gox and Ghidra emerged from the underbrush simultaneously with twin roars. Each swung a massive hooked blade down into the nightmare. The weapons bit deep, carving through dark scales, and the monster screamed again and thrashed in the net, pulling away from Lukka. Its tail curved around, slamming into Gox from behind. He stumbled forward, nearly entangling himself in the net, and the nightmare twisted toward him, jaw gaping. Ghidra wrenched her sword free and swung again, nearly severing one of the creature's hind limbs. Lukka sprang to his feet and lunged forward, sword in hand. His weapon sank into the nightmare's cheek, jamming its head against its body. He held it there, putting all his weight on the blade as Gox scrambled backward. Claws tore at the turf by his feet. "Any time, Nick," Lukka shouted. "Would you just shoot it?" With Gox out of range, the nightmare twisted back toward Lukka, its strength knocking him off his feet. He scrambled backward in the dirt as it reared over him, his sword still stuck in its head, its maw open wide. Nick's crossbow snapped, and a bolt appeared in the monster's open mouth, embedded to the fletching in the back of its throat. The impact snapped the creature's head back, and its body thrashed wildly. But these were its death throes. Its head hit the turf with a thump, jaw still working as the red glow faded from its eyes. "Gotta go in through the throat," Nick said, strolling back into the clearing with her bow over one shoulder. "Too much bone in the way to try it through the forehead. I'd only have pissed it off." "One of these days, you're going to line up the perfect shot after I get my head ripped off," Lukka said, extending a hand. Nick grabbed him and helped him up. "If I do, can I have your extra knife? I've always liked the one with the little golden eagle on the hilt." Aoife tried to apologize all the way home. "The failure is mine, Captain. If my snare had been better positioned..." "It wasn't the position that was the problem, Sergeant. That thing moved like it had no bones. You couldn't have anticipated that." "I could have..." "Enough," Lukka said, clapping her on the shoulder. "The monster's dead, and we're not. That's what matters." "And," Nick said, "we've got 4 days of leave owing. 4 days without anything trying to kill us." 4 days without having to get up at dawn," Ghidra said. "Which means 4 nights of drinking the bloody pub dry," Gox added. "Here's to that. There's a bottle of 3 with my name on them." Lukka grinned to himself at the banter. Truth be told, he had a bottle waiting as well. Top-end stuff from the south he'd talked a trader friend out of. It wasn't the bottle that haunted his dreams though, but smooth, dark skin and silky raven hair. 4 days of leave. There were definitely worse prospects. The road grew wider and more heavily trafficked as they made their way south toward Drannith. The third ring was more heavily patrolled and dotted with walled and guarded hamlets. The boundary with the second ring was marked by a stone wall, 8 feet high, with a wall walk for guards and warning crystals at regular intervals. This was the outer layer of Drannith's true defenses, intended to turn away smaller creatures. A really large monster could break through, but not undetected. The guards at the gates saluted smartly as the specials came through, and admiring glances followed the squad as they passed into the second ring. For most Coppercoats, joining the specials was only a fantasy, but it was rare to find a young soldier who didn't hope to one day be a part of the elite. That had been Lukka once. How times change, he thought, as he grinned at a fresh-faced girl in a newly minted uniform. The second ring was the heart of Drannith's hinterland, a wide belt of flat country where every available square foot was planted with whatever crops it would support. Vast fields of wheat stretched out from the wall, with hills leveled or terraced into more growing land by generations of hard-working farmers. Where the ground was wrong for grains, there were potatoes or grapevines. Scraps went to pigs and chickens. Everything that could be used was. The city elders were adamant. Today, Drannith might be strong, but the monsters of Ikoria would never stop, and there would come a day when the city needed every bit of its reserves. It was drummed into every schoolchild how close the city had come to destruction on several occasions, and the need for every citizen to do their part to keep it from ever happening again. Beyond the second ring was the secondary wall, an unimpressive name for a truly imposing fortification. It was 20 feet high, broad enough for 4 men to walk side by side, faced with smooth stone tiles that offered no purchase to claws or talons. In addition to the warning crystals on their high stone minarets, there were turreted ballistae at regular intervals with their huge barbed bolts and coils of chain stacked beside them. Patrols were constant, not just ordinary Coppercoats, but heavily armored lancers and mages from the arcane corps. The gates were open, a steady stream of carts and other traffic leaving the city. But Lukka knew a spring-loaded counterweight mechanism could slam the massive doors shut in seconds. The first ring had once been the entirety of Drannith's domain, all the city had been able to protect from the monsters that besieged it. Now, It had largely been taken over by sprawling military complexes, rows of barracks, training fields, and administration buildings spread out between the secondary wall and the city proper, dedicated to instructing and equipping the next generation of Coppercoats. There was industry there, too, forges and foundries, workshops, and centers for arcane research. Looming over all of it was the city wall, the pride of generations of engineers. Since the moment the first stone had been laid, back in the misty depths of the city's history, it had never been breached. No matter what monsters came down from the plain, what monstrosities Ikoria sent against it, Drannith the Invincible had persevered, prospering where other sanctuaries had fallen in fire and blood, the stone battlements bristling with ballistae and other heavy weapons wreathed in protective magic rose up over the first ring like a cliff of stone, barely conceivable as something built by human hands. And beyond that, of course, was the city itself, Lukka's beloved Drannith, with its crystal-topped spires, its straight-backed radial bridges, its winding markets and hole-in-the-wall restaurants and unexpected parks. An oasis of safety at the center of a dangerous world. In the middle of it all was the citadel, built around the huge shape of the Argalith, the largest crystal ever discovered in Savai. It was the linchpin of the city's defense. By studying the flickers in its depths, Coppercoat mages could track the monsters as they approached and direct their resources accordingly. It also happened to be the home of the most beautiful woman in the world. Lukka smiled wider and quickened his steps. The most beautiful woman in the world glared at him over the top of her half-moon spectacles. "Would you please take this seriously, Lukka?" "I am," Lukka protested. "I told you." Dureena looked down at the paper on her desk. It was big and black, wriggled out of a net. "I think a captain of the specials can be a bit more informative than that." "It was a nightmare. You know what they're like. Lots of red eyes, lots of spikes. Sort of. Off-putting." Lukka flopped into one of the office chairs. "What does it matter?" "Collecting data is one of the keys to our defense," Dureena said, pen scratching. "I'm pretty sure the key to our defense is getting out there and killing the bloody things. As long as we know how to kill them, and where they're coming from, and what they like to eat, and the scents that attract them." "All right!" Lukka held up his hands in surrender. "It's important. I get it. But won't they tell you all about the thing when they butcher it?" "I have to make a presentation to the general before that," Dureena said. She glanced at a clock on the office wall and made a face. "In fact, I ought to be getting ready for that." She pushed her chair back from her desk and stood up, tall and slim, with dark skin and black hair primly bound back. Dureena never failed to take Lukka's breath away, even in the unflattering cut of a formal uniform. He got up as well and intercepted her as she made for the door. "So that's it," he said, grinning at her. "You're not happy to see me?" "Of course I'm happy to see you." Dureena paused in front of him, her expression softening a little. "I'm always happy to see you, Lukka. I'm glad you're okay. Right now is just..." She shook her head and dug her fingernails in her hair. "You know the general." "I do know the general," Lukka said. "Let me guess. You're going to be sitting in a row of 40 other soldiers, and you'll stand up for 2 minutes, tell them everything's fine, and sit back down while they argue for an hour about grain allocations." "Probably." Dureena watched him out of the corner of her eye. "So?" Lukka slipped behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Dureena leaned against him, her weight warm and comforting. He propped his chin on her shoulder. "So skip it," he said. "You know you want to." "The general..." "I think he'll forgive you." Lukka pressed his lips to Dureena's neck and felt her shiver. "What's the point of having the most powerful man in Drannith for a father, if you won't get to skip class once in a while?" "You're impossible," Dureena said. But she didn't pull away as Lukka kissed his way up her neck towards her ear. "And I assume you have an alternative in mind?" "I have 4 days of leave," Lukka said. "I can tell you how I'd like to spend them." Lukka pulled her a little tighter against him. "Besides, I got you a present. Blood wine. The real stuff." "Where did you find that?" "You don't want to know." "Probably not," she sighed. "I suppose Lieutenant Seicho can deliver the report." "Absolutely," Lukka murmured, sliding his hands along her flanks. "I have absolute faith in Lieutenant What's-his-name." Dureena took firm hold of Lukka's wandering hands and pulled them apart. "Not in the office, Lukka." "Then let's get out of the office, shall we?" She gave him a stern look. Then her real smile broke through. A smile he'd fallen in love with, broad and genuine and just a little mischievous. It was hard to find some days, under the armor plating of Captain Dureena, daughter of the great General Kudro, but it was always there, somewhere beneath. "You'd better not be teasing about the blood wine," she said. Lukka put his hand over his heart in a mock salute. "Never." Dureena's rooms in the Citadel were a compromise between her official rank and her unofficial position. As a mere staff captain, she rated only a simple 2-room suite, not much more space than Lukka had down in the barracks. Because she was the daughter of General Kudro, commander of Drannith's entire military, that 2-room suite was on the top floor of the Citadel, with broad windows looking out over the city instead of buried in the depths of the great fortress with only candles for light. She also had a nice big bed instead of Lukka's narrow cot. Not that they'd never manage in the cot, of course, but having room to stretch out made for a much more pleasant night's sleep. Now Lukka opened his eyes and yawned, watching the lines of sunlight sneaking past the blinds cut across the floor and savoring the unaccustomed feeling of waking up long after dawn. Dureena lay naked beside him, having kicked the sheets to the floor of the bed in her sleep, as she nearly always did. She was on her stomach, face squashed against her pillow, brow creased as though deep in thought. He wanted to run a hand down the deep brown curve of her flank, to run his fingers across the taut muscles of her back, but he restrained himself. "She deserves to sleep in as much as I do." Instead, he got up and wandered into the sitting room, looking for something to drink. The bottle of blood wine lay toppled over on the table, trailing a trickle of dark red. Lukka found a mug and a pitcher, poured himself some water, and returned to bed to find Dureena sitting up and stretching. Her hair, released from its braid, fell loose and disheveled across her shoulders. "Here," Lukka said, handing her the cup. She drank appreciatively and handed it back. "How do you feel?" "Not nearly as hungover as I ought to be," Dureena said. "Told you it was the real stuff," Lukka said. His own head throbbed, but only a little. "With the best blood wine, you can drink all night and hardly feel it in the morning." Dureena smiled crookedly, then eyed the sunlight creeping across the floor. "My father's going to be annoyed when he finds out." "He agreed to let us get engaged," Lukka said. "So he has only himself to blame." "I didn't give him much of a choice," Dureena said. "You never told me how you got him to give in." "Persistence," Dureena said, with another smile. "Even your father must take days off now and then." "You'd be surprised. He says the monsters never do." That did sound like General Kudro. Lukka had to agree. The man seemed to be made out of iron, an automaton beyond merely human frailties. It was hard to imagine how he'd ended up with a daughter, in truth. Hard to picture him unbending long enough to fall in love and be a father. Maybe he's gotten harder over the years. Neither Dureena nor the general talked about Dureena's mother, and all Lukka knew was that she died long ago. "Well," he said, skating over the awkward moment, "fortunately, you and I aren't solely responsible for defending Drannith from the ravening hordes. I think the rest of the Coppercoats can pick up the slack for a couple of days." "I don't know, Lukka," Dureena said with a sigh. I should at least check in. There might be something... There was a sharp rap at the room door. Lukka and Dureena looked at one another and finished together. Something important. The first specials were not happy at having their bender interrupted and told Lukka so as soon as he entered the small briefing room. 4 days, Captain, Nick fulminated. You told us 4 days. You can't drag us out now. That's worse than when a bouncer yanks you out of the bar before you're even properly drunk. You know that doesn't happen if you pay your tab, Gedra said. What would you know about paying your tab, said Gox. We always arm wrestle for it fair and square, Gedra said, grinning at her twin. It's not my fault you're a wimp. Squad reporting as ordered, Aoife said. Her eyes were bloodshot, but her back was still straight and her salute was crisp. Thank you, Sergeant. Lukka cleared his throat and raised his voice. That's enough moaning. This one's hot, and we're already behind. He pointed to the table where a map was laid out. Something flew into the second ring last night. It went to ground after dodging a few ballista bolts and holed up in a small farmstead. Sector Command sent 20 swords in after it, and only 2 of them came back. That quieted everyone down. Aoife raised her hand, and Lukka nodded to her. Did those 2 have anything to say about what we're dealing with? Definitely a cat, Lukka said. A big one. And a flyer, obviously. Nothing beyond that. They've been keeping eyes on the farm from the wall, and it hasn't gone anywhere. Probably gorging, Nick said. Cats love to eat one big meal, and then spend days sleeping it off. Whatever it's doing, we're going in after it, Lukka said. Meet at the Citadel gate in a quarter of an hour, with all your gear. He had to give them credit. Hangovers or not, they did as they were ordered, and the first specials headed out no more than 20 minutes later, taking one of the elevated bridges built to help the military bypass crowded city streets. By noon, they were through the gate in the secondary wall and into the second ring, taking a curving path that forked off from the main highway and ran between rippling fields of late summer grain. What's our approach, Captain? Aoife said. Close up again, Lukka said. Has to be. This time, not even Nick put in her usual objection. The sniper might prefer to engage at long range, but that was too dangerous with flyers. Give it the opportunity to get airborne, and there's no telling what it might do. Trying to pin down a swooping, clawing monster was bad enough. Too many creatures could spit acid, breathe fire, throw spikes, or otherwise threaten from beyond sword's reach. Better to start up close and keep it that way. There's the farm, Gedra said. Looks intact from here. I don't like it, Gox muttered. Even a big cat will have a lot of places to hide. Lukka nodded in agreement. The farmstead coming into view comprised 3 buildings, a 2-story house, squat and thick-walled with heavily shuttered windows, plus a long, covered processing area and a tall, stale-roofed barn. All 3 were large enough to conceal a monster, and the grain was tall enough that it could conceivably be hiding almost anywhere. Blades out, Lukka said. Stay behind me. The road widened, joining the wide circle of turned dirt that surrounded the farmstead's buildings. A farm cart lay on its side in front of the barn, with a dead horse still tangled in its traces. Its blood pooled in a muddy slick. Coppercoat bodies dotted the ground, torn open or curled up around the wounds that had killed them. Here and there, a ripped uniform flapped as the wind tugged at it, but otherwise the yard was still. No, Lukka thought. I don't like it one bit. Go in there, and it was more likely the monster would ambush them instead of the other way around. We've got to get it in the open, on our terms. He glanced over his shoulder. Not much cover, though. All right, he said aloud. Aoife, do you have enough tripwire to cover the gap between the shed and the barn? The sergeant nodded. It'll be thinner, but I can do it. We'll be a little more spread out than usual, but it'll have to do. Gedra, Gox, you take cover there. He indicated the near walls of the two buildings, which faced one another across the corpse-strewn yard. "Nick, can you manage in the grain?" "If I lie down," Nick said, "it'll give me a good shot, but reloading is going to be slow." "If you're good as usual, we won't need more than one," Lukka said. "I'll be right about here." He stamped his foot in the dirt. "So try not to hit me." "No promises, Captain," Nick said. She grinned, but it faded when she looked back at the dead Coppercoats. "Let's slaughter this thing and get home." Aoife was already setting up her traps. Nick cranked her crossbow and knocked a bolt, covering the sergeant while she worked, while Ghidra and Cox crouched against the walls of the outbuildings. There was still no movement in the yard, no sign that the creature had noticed them. "Hopefully, Ghidra's right, and it's sleeping off a big meal." That would make it slower, and Lukka was happy to accept any advantage. After a few minutes, Aoife gave him a thumbs up, then picked her way through the tripwires to join him. She rooted through her pack and came up with a jar of greenish liquid. "This one's brand new," she said. "Research guarantees no cat can resist it." "Let's see if they know what they're talking about," Lukka said. He unscrewed the top of the jar and winced at the sharp scent that emerged. "Get to cover." Aoife saluted and scurried over to crouch beside Ghidra. Lukka looked over the corpse-strewn field, rubbed his knuckles on the hilt of his sword, and waited. "Well," Gox muttered, "I guess this settles whether research knows what they're talking about." "Quiet," Lukka hissed. The air was full of the rank scent of the bait. It had to have diffused all over the farmstead by now, but they'd been waiting nearly an hour, and there was no sign of the monster. Maybe it really is asleep. That would be inconvenient. If they went inside looking for it, and ended up in a fight in close waters, somebody was going to get killed. "It'll have to come out eventually, or..." He stretched, shoulder popping, then froze. There had been a soft noise, down at the edge of hearing. A scrape, claw against wood. Nothing had moved, but... "Stay sharp," Lukka muttered. "I think it's close." The wall beside Gox shattered. Unlike the fortified farmhouse, the shed was made of flimsy boards which burst outward in a splintery crash as the monster's paw came through. It was enormous, bigger than a man's head, with foot-long claws extended. Gox had time to give a startled yelp as it raked him across the midsection, the razor tips of its talons slicing easily through leather, skin, and muscle. Gox dropped to his knees, clutching at the wound, skeins of shredded guts slipping past his fingers in a torrent of blood. There was a moment of stunned silence, then Ghidra screamed an oath and drew her sword, and Lukka went for his own weapon. The monster's paw withdrew, and there was a warning creak of wood. Then it exploded through the roof of the processing shed in a single prodigious leap. The thing was huge, half again the size of the nightmare they'd killed 2 nights before, easily taller than Lukka, and longer than a cart. Its basic form was cat-like, with thick white fur cut by light brown stripes, forelegs, and muzzle spattered with blood. Fangs glistened in its gaping mouth, including 2 long incisors that protruded beyond its lower lip like a pair of swords. At the top of its leap, it snapped open leathery wings, gliding easily in spite of its size. It aimed itself right at Ghidra and Aoife. Ghidra had her hooked great sword out and drew back for a swing as the thing closed. At the last moment, though, it pulled its wings in and dove, and the massive blade whistled over its head. Before Ghidra could recover, it pounced, forepaws slamming into her chest and knocking her to the ground. Her scream cut off abruptly as the monster closed its jaw on her throat and tore, unleashing a spray of blood. The thing gave a brief yowl, the first sound the Lukka had heard it make when Aoife plunged her short sword in its flank. It rounded on her, and she pulled the blade free and danced away. "It's so fast!" Lukka had his own sword out, but he'd barely managed to take 2 steps toward Ghidra before the creature had torn out her throat. Now he watched Aoife back away, quick and careful. The monster padded quietly toward her. Lukka went to join her, but the sergeant held up a warning hand. Face a mask of concentration. The tripwires, Lukka realized. Aoife had stepped back into her own trap, hoping to lure the cat after her. If it goes off, it'll tear her to shreds. The metal hooks and wires were designed to bite through the tough skin of monsters, and he could only imagine what they do to a human body. Lukka had pulled up short, watching as Aoife waved her bloody sword at the creature. "Come on!" the diminutive sergeant shouted. "Come and get me!" The winged cat raised one paw, then stopped. It stood there, glaring at Aoife, then turned away with a growl, head swinging toward Lukka. "It saw the trap! The damn thing was faster and smarter than it had any right to be." Lukka backed up, sword raised. "If it pounces, and I duck, then maybe." There was a snap, and Nick's oversized bolt sprouted in the monster's shoulder. It turned away from Lukka, yowling in protest, and launched itself into another gliding leap. Nick had jumped to her feet, winding furiously to reset her crossbow. "She's not going to make it!" "Nick, run!" Lukka shouted, knowing it was too late. "Aoife, to me! We're falling back!" He wasn't sure if Nick heard him, but she reached the same conclusion, tossing her bow away and bolting through the field. The monster flared its wings as it dove, catching up with her easily. It grabbed her by the throat, spear-like incisors slicing deep, but she was still struggling as it lifted her off the ground. Then it gave a fast, hard shake, just like a house cat with a mouse, and the sniper's struggle subsided into shudders, her head lolling on a broken neck. Aoife leaped clear of the tripwires. Lukka pointed to the road. "Go!" he shouted. "I'm right behind you." She hesitated. "Go!" he screamed as the cat dropped Nick in a heap and turned toward them. Aoife started to run. The monster, catching the movement, gathered itself for a leap. Lukka scrambled sideways, interposing himself, sword ready to jam into the thing's throat. "Even if it gets me, maybe I can take it down. Maybe. Maybe. It was so fast! Dureena, I'm sorry." The monster descended, wings flaring. Huge talon paws reached out for Lukka, and he lunged, sword extending, and then a flash of green light.